You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 129, Speaking Taiwanese. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. This week, we're having a deep and impactful conversation about Taiwanese language, heritage, culture, and identity with Erica of Kuishimbo and the World Languages Project. Now, what I love about this conversation is not only the way Erica tells a story, but also that we're taking a closer look at how language and the loss and gain of it, the way it's used and weaponized, even criminalized, can have a lasting effect on generations of families in society. Erica talks to us about growing up in California of mixed Asian heritage and experiencing proximity to her parents' languages. She talks to us about the disconnection she felt from her ancestry at times and some of the steps and practices she put in place to reestablish that connection. She talks about learning Taiwanese and how she's been able to learn the language while she's been living in Taiwan for the past few years. I want to give you all a fair warning. There is a fair amount of discussion around trauma, both racial and generational, in this conversation. So if this is something that you're also working through, I just want you to be warned before you listen. Thank you to Erica for being so candid and so open about not just your journey, but also sharing your Taiwanese heritage and language with all of us. If you enjoy episodes of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now pledge ongoing support for the show on buymeacoffee.com or on patreon.com. Special shout out to Speaking Tongues' recent supporters and patrons Heidi L, Linnea H, Pat N, and Yari A. For just $5 a month, you will have access to excerpts from this conversation that did not make it to the full published episode. And as you know, I wrote a book. My food zine of international language and cuisine, Taste Buds Volume 1, is available now for purchase. Check social media for the sneak peek inside the book and make sure you purchase one for yourself and one for your friends. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Erica. How are you today, Erica?
I'm well, thank you, Elle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy that, we were able to find this time to talk. I know that we are 12 hours apart, I think. Yeah, and you're in Taiwan and I'm here in New York City. So thank you so much for making this time for this conversation.
Pleasure. I'm open heart. I know we've exchanged open heart emojis before, so.
I like to start each episode of the podcast with the same question. And that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
So the first language I heard was probably Japanese, my mother tongue. And then the first language I spoke was American English. Since I have an older sister and she started preschool, kindergarten, and started making friends and passing on cool words like copycat. So that's, yeah. And then I learned to speak, I would say I'm rusty, but like conversational level Japanese and Mandarin. Mandarin I'm using here in Taiwan. And then I've learned some words and phrases in my heritage language, Taiwanese Hokkien. And here in Taiwan, we call it Daiwan Wei or Daigi.
Oh, how interesting. I didn't know that. I think that's really interesting that you have such a mix of languages that you were exposed to from such a young age.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's kind of like I'm working backwards now because I it's like English and Japanese were actually prioritized growing up, for like school and for Saturday school. And then, so I'm sort of catching up now with the Taiwanese, which was something I heard at home, but I never learned to understand or speak it. Yeah.
Did you go to Japanese school?
I did. Like from age 5, we were in the Gardena Buddhist Church. And, I grew up down in Palos Verdes. And so our parents would drive us out to Gardena Buddhist Church. And so that's where we went to Nihongo Gakko on Saturdays. And I learned like pretty basic stuff like katakana, hiragana, some kanji maybe. And then when we moved to the west side of LA, I started at Sawtell Gakuin and went there every Saturday. And then I actually learned Latin in school, like in regular school, which seems really kind of nerdy. But that is the language I chose to learn. And then I switched to Japanese again, like later in high school. Didn't learn Taiwanese Hokkien until like a semester into like basically maybe sophomore, junior year of college at Berkeley. I learned Taiwanese for the first time. And then after that, after I graduated Berkeley, I moved to Taipei and learned Mandarin for 2 years.
Wow. First thing I want to say is I also studied Latin for 4 years in high school. And I don't think it's nerdy. I think Latin is amazing.
It is amazing. I wish I remembered more of it. Yeah.
So do I. The second thing I was going to ask you was, so you grew up in Southern California in the Los Angeles area. Were there, I guess in your community, were there many people who spoke Japanese, who spoke Mandarin or Taiwanese Hokkien at all? Or did you notice that was more of like family language or community language? Like, how did you notice the languages being shared among people?
So I actually grew up like in school, like when I was going to middle school and high school in LA, on the west side of LA. I grew up in 7th grade going to bat and bar mitzvahs. So I would so most of my classmates were actually Jewish American, and I grew up, like you go to temple before the party, and so you might hear some like Hebrew. And then obviously in Southern California, there's a ton of Spanish. I would say that that's the dominant language other than English that's spoken in my community. But in terms of like, maybe when I was younger, when I was in like the Gardena Buddhist Church, that's when I would hear more like Japanese. And then if we had relatives that they would speak Taiwanese with my dad. All my grandparents with us, they spoke with my sisters and me, they spoke Nihongo, Japanese. But like with my dad, my akon and ama would speak Taiwanese. And their generation was colonized. And so they pretty much spoke like native level Japanese. And so since my mom didn't speak Taiwanese, she knew some words and greetings, but not like she wasn't conversational. And my dad went to like college in Japan. So he's like fluent. So then the default was at home was pretty much like Japanese and English. If our parents spoke to us in Japanese growing up, I was kind of naughty. I replied in English. And I had sisters, so sometimes we would even speak in code, like using slang so that they wouldn't understand like what we were up to on Friday night or whatever. And then I grew up in the Bay. Like I went to college in Berkeley. And when you go to college, like that's the first time I met like people from other parts of California. And so I was exposed to some like slang from NorCal, like the North Bay, where my freshman year roommate was from. So, there you hear things like hecka instead of hella. And then out there in Oakland, you hear like hyphy and other kind of youth slang. So that's kind of like more of the landscape, I think, linguistically in California.
You have this language, I don't want to call it a barrier, but you have your parents are speaking their languages, and you and your sister, I guess, are speaking English. So, what was the dynamic like when, like, did your parents want you to learn the languages? I mean, you did go to Japanese school, but like, did they want you to communicate with them? And did they want you to communicate with your grandparents, with your elders? Did they express a specific interest about passing their languages on to you? Was it something that you wanted and felt like you didn't have enough tools to, you know, acquire the language? Like, what was that like, I guess?
That's a really good question. I feel like you're like picking up on, yeah, that's like a really good question because it's true. Like our parents, both of them were actually very good at languages themselves. Like my mom was an interpreter when she was in Japan, and she would interpret meetings. I think Papa mentioned that she worked like even with folks from like the Dubai, UAE region. And so she was also very international. She had studied abroad in Canada, and so she was actually on vacation in Los Angeles when she met my dad. Okay. It was not intended that they were going to meet on holiday, like she was going to be on holiday and meet him, and then end up staying and then like raising kids, you know. But my dad was also really good at languages. Like he English is his fourth language. So he's like, he grew up, you know, in the home speaking Dai, right? Daiwan Wei is what he calls it. And then, but his parents were colonized by Japan. So they can also speak Nihongo, but together they always spoke Daiwan Wei. And then he went to college in Japan, like at one of like the best private university in Tokyo is Keio. And Papa went to Keio, and so he's fluent at that level. And I always grew up thinking like, oh, I wish I could, you know, like when you do MASH and stuff, like I would always put like Keio University. It never happened, but it was always like a dream. I remember visiting and stuff. And so and then his generation in Taiwan was part of that martial law generation that was forced to speak Zhongwen, Mandarin. So like Taiwanese was banned like in his generation. And so the language erasure kind of happened, like with our generation. A lot of initially when I was meeting friends, they weren't able to speak Taiwanese. But because we had grown up in the US, like I didn't have this cultural history. Like, you know, they're not teaching Taiwanese history in American schools. And so I was kind of ignorant about the cultural history, even when I got to Taiwan, the first time I studied abroad after college. I could share that story because it kind of shows like how little I knew about my cultural history after college, which is kind of sad, you know. But my parents, I think what they got really right was like and I'm kind of glad they used everything they could. They used like manipulation, like and I think this is true for a lot of parents that like because I've talked to language partners about this, they put the pressure on to practice the language. They'll use everything. Like I had sisters, so they'll like they'll be like, well, you know, so and so is like speaking in Nihongo, and you know, you should really practice. And like they would literally use manipulation and this kind of stuff to like get us to speak better Nihongo. But like it wasn't until like now that I myself like decided, like as part of like, I guess as part of my, honestly, as part of like my larger healing, like in my later 30s, I started to realize that there are all these missing puzzle pieces. And so like, to be really honest, I was like talking to my therapist in the Bay Area. Like our last session was about like finding my missing puzzle pieces in Taiwan. And so I was going to go back. You know, I pretty much spent all my life in the US, except for the 2 years I was in Taipei after college to learn Mandarin, and 6 months in 2015, I think, that I was in Japan. And then I knew I had these sort of parts of the story that were just missing. And I knew that I could just go back to Taiwan and I could find them missing puzzle pieces. And so I think that was, so coming here was more like my own desire to reconnect with my cultural heritage and lineage, and through language exchange and oral history, I've been able to like put all these puzzle pieces together. But initially, I would say like my parents, and I'm really grateful that they really, really did everything they could to like insist that we like remember our languages. And then they would every summer, since we were babies, they would fly back to Kaohsiung and to Yokohama so that we could spend weeks with our grandparents. Yeah, and I'm really glad that they did that every summer. So we were really close to our grandparents. Like, even though I didn't have like a language nest like in California necessarily, like they did visit, but because we had those summers, like I would have like a deeper like rootedness like in these countries. Like, and so I have these experiences being like a little girl, like 12 in Japan, exploring on my own. Like, and I have some funny experiences too. But, stuff like that. I think that's it kind of, maybe it's why also that like sometimes I'm like, people are like, where are you from? Because maybe they pick up on that rootedness that I have a deep connection to those countries as well as being very American.
That's so interesting that you said that. In my case, my mother's family is from the Bahamas. And I grew up going to the Bahamas every summer and not really like living there like a citizen or like a resident, but just going to see family and going, my mom would go and my brother and I, with my mom and my grandmother, and show us around places that she remembered, show us places where, that were part of her memory bank. And it's interesting because I have such memories of being in this part of the world that I don't have any like long-standing connection to. Like, I would never call myself Bahamian because I'm not born there and my mother was not born there. It's just, it's a generational connection that we have going further back than my mom. So it's like, and I even feel like even in my late 30s, like coming to like trying to find this rootedness and like, what do I call myself? Like, where do I belong? How do I feel so connected to a place that I don't hold a passport to, or a place that I don't speak the local dialect and I don't have an accent and I don't, trying to like find the connection where they're, being a very much a New Yorker, but having this heritage at the same time that I feel so connected to, but yet so distant from. And this is not an episode about me, but I just wanted to say that in terms of your story, I think it's an interesting thing to note about identity because it's not black and white. And this is why I want to have these conversations about maybe not even finding an answer, because we're all on our journeys. So we may not get to that answer. We may not have that answer, but even our journey doesn't look the same. Our journey in finding the pieces and putting things together doesn't look the same, doesn't feel the same, and they can be similar in certain ways. But I really love that, and I picked that out of the story that you were saying because of how I feel about my journey as well. And this is, I think, the beauty of a podcast like this, because I'm African American and you're Asian American, but we have these parallels, and I want people to see that you can be different but you can be similar, and that's the beauty of our humanity. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was, like, I think it's beautiful that you made that huge move to Taiwan in order to find that piece of your journey and put that puzzle piece there, and to reclaim a piece of your identity. And I really am curious to know, I guess, before that, what were some of the ways that you were able to connect with your Taiwanese heritage, and what were some of the things away from language? Like, what were some of the things that you were able to do to have that connection at all?
Yeah, I guess because, well, growing up in LA, like once we moved to the West Side, around Lunar New Year, I have a distinct memory where, we'd be driving out in the minivan, like we had an MPV, and my parents drove us out to like Monterey Park to get the Lunar New Year foods. And I actually learned how to say some of them. Like there's one that's like this, it's kind of like the size of like a Costco muffin. Like it's pretty big and firm, but it's like technically a sponge cake and it's tan color. And it's called huat gui. And then there's this like it's kind of flat and round, and it's like really sticky mochi cake, like stickier than daifuku, stickier than gyuhi, stickier than like ohagi. It's just very sticky, like it gets on your teeth and fingers. It's called dinkwe. And then we would go for, you might know this one. It's lobo gao. It's like a daikon radish cake. It's really yummy. It's called lobo gao in Zhongwen and then giamgui in Taiwanese. But so we would go like around the Lunar New Year. Like in our family, obviously, like January 1st, we always did the Japanese osechi ryori. That's the priority. Like that's the one we celebrate. But then also since LA has, you could just drive like, I guess, 45 minutes from our house to Monterey Park and then be able to get these yummy treats. And so as a little kid, like that was the best. Like, or even going for dim sum, like that's more Shanghai. It's more Hong Kong, but it still feels very close to something you might eat in Taiwan, like a really good dim sum. And so we were able to get those foods like in LA or the larger part, like San Gabriel Valley, Arcadia. There's actually a really good Taiwanese restaurant called Simbala in Arcadia. And you can actually get like very authentic Taiwanese like noodles, and it tastes like it feels like you're actually in Taiwan. And so I guess a lot of it, if it wasn't language, it was really through food. What I'm learning though, it's a global phenomenon. Like I felt like, okay, Taiwanese people are obviously perpetually hungry, but then I start to learn about other places and I was like, okay, they also have like their own dumplings or their own rice and beans, or you know what I mean? So it's like I feel like every culture has their grubbers, like the people who get really excited about their cultural foods. And obviously my mom, luckily she was like a really good cook, so we got to grow up eating like, you know, all of her in Nihongo it's kate ryori, like Japanese home cooking. And then she also learned some Taiwanese dishes. So one that we always made at home that she made was the Taiwanese like omelets, and they put like she puts like a it's like it's called hoshi daikon, so it's like a dried radish turnip thing, and then with negi, like a green onion. Or she learned how to make like a Taiwanese noodle dish with like ground beef and egg that Ama made. And so she would incorporate, they would make our cultural foods at home. And then like for birthdays, she'd ask me like, what do you want to eat? And I would always say like temaki sushi. It's like you get all the ingredients and you can make it yourself, like your own hand rolls. Um, and it's LA, like LA has the best like Asian food, like just like New York, I'm sure. New York has so much diversity of food, but also LA has like you can go to Thai town, you can go to Koreatown, you can go to Chinatown. There's really yummy pupusas. There are East LA has really yummy, taco trucks. Like even so does like Venice Beach, or like Oakland has really yummy taco trucks, like with pescados, like so I think it's like that. It's really through food and then maybe through grocery stores.
Food is the great connector, I think. Um, which is why I wrote my book over the summer because language and food to me is like this, like, you know. Um, so when you and you know what's funny is like I still want to talk about food later because I feel like even though you gave an overview of the foods, I feel like there's still more to talk about when it comes to food. So we'll talk about food a little bit later. You decided to move to Taiwan, and I would love to know what were some of the things that went into that decision to move there, and was it something you had been thinking about for a while? Was it on a whim? How did you come to that decision to move?
I think the main impetus was because I remember distinctly, like I was living in Berkeley in this house. It's like the Fairview house. Like I was living in a community and the pandemic hit and it was like a time when it was before the vaccines and I was basically hearing about like incidents of anti-Asian violence, like through friends. Like I would hear from a Taiwanese friend who had moved from Taipei to San Francisco and heard from a friend who knew someone who got beat up in the Bay. Or I would just read about, like the Burmese man in Midland, Texas, and his young son who got like stabbed, or just like it started to freak me out. Like I started to get like, I think I just, every time I left the house, I was terrified. And it was like around that early part of the pandemic. Like it was like very early stages where it was kind of hitting like places like Italy harder. And it was also even hitting, I had a friend in Taiwan actually who was, because of the proximity to, the, where it started, like people in Taiwan and people like in Italy were actually feeling the effects of it more early on. And so they were communicating like what they were going through with the healthcare system and all of that. And so back then, like it wasn't affecting Berkeley so much, but I would hear it from people who were in different places that were closer to the impact. And so I guess I started to think, and just because like also Taiwan at the time, like they were really handling it really well. And so when I ended up moving, it was actually like 0 cases of COVID, like in Taiwan. Like that's, you know what I mean? So there was that, like Taiwan was like mitigating really well. And then I was also in the US, like not, I mean, I think you can relate to this. It's like being a woman of color. You're a Black woman, but during a pandemic, it's like being Asian female. You might be able to understand how that could be unsafe. Like I would like for years, actually, even before the pandemic, I felt like I would get harassed, like in the grocery store, like in a workplace, in housing, and just like, you know what I mean? I just would experience trauma, like racial trauma, like misogyny, like all this kind of stuff. And it was just like, by the time the pandemic hit, I was like, all of that had accumulated. And then I was also terrified, absolutely terrified. And it was sort of like all of this structural stuff was already traumatizing before the pandemic. And then, all the Me Too stuff. It was just like living in America is a traumatizing experience. And I just sort of realized I could go somewhere else. Like I could go to my heritage country. And also, I think when all the anti-Asian violence was happening, and I blogged about this, it actually made me take more interest in my heritage. Like because of the anti-Asian violence, I took more interest and more curiosity in Asian heritage. Like it made me more proud to be Asian. It made me want to learn more about Taiwanese language. It made me want to express it more. Like, and if people were racist, like I would want to express it even more. Like it just brought it out, like a sense of pride, I guess. Once the second shot was like 90% effective, I got on a plane and flew to Taiwan to quarantine. And it was like during quarantine, it was 0 cases of COVID in Taiwan. And then when I got out of the quarantine hotel, about like a day and a half later, I had about a day and a half in Taipei to explore with my aunt and uncle. And then they announced that the country was going into soft lockdown. So it was just like weird timing. But even then, it's still safe. It was still safer than being in the US. And I feel like there's also during COVID, I realized like there are parts of me that are actually more Taiwanese. Like it kind of brought it out more. Like here, people are much more, there's like this village people vibe, like a communal, it's like a community thing where the US has it too, like through mutual aid and stuff, I think it comes out. But for the most part, I would say that the policies were more like individualist in the US, but in Taiwan, it felt more like people would mask to protect others. And so for me, I guess during COVID, I felt more comfortable being in Taiwan than in the US. And so that was also a driver.
I'm sorry for all of that trauma that you experienced. That's horrific. The past couple of years have just brought out the worst in a lot of people. And I think they've also brought out the best in a lot of people. But I think it, unfortunately, like you said, our former president just caused like a lot of trash to come to the surface and for people to be okay with hatred, and hatred is not okay. So I'm really sorry to hear that you experienced all of that. And it sounds to me like Taiwan, well, you also said this earlier, is like a part of your healing and a part of that reconnection process was a part of healing. So I hope you're safe. I hope you feel safe in Taiwan, and that process is happening for you, that you are healing.
Anyone who might be healing, like in my 30s, it was more about, it was sort of like I had to even go to therapy only to because there were just parts of like, it was that I was disconnected from cultural history, my language, and all of that caused some suffering. Like, I don't even know how to describe it, but that's sort of why I had to heal. Like in many ways, it comes out psychosomatically, like through the body, or it can come out in relationships. But it's sort of like the more I understood my cultural history, the more I understood the intergenerational events that got passed down, like the historical events that took place in my grandparents' and parents' generation, that it became easier to heal, because a lot of being a person in the growing up in the US, being born in the US, a lot of the trauma or a lot of the suffering can come through that break, like the migration, when a parent migrates to another country, marries outside their culture, and then has to raise their kids in like the United States. Some of that, a big chunk of the trauma or suffering or pain is from that, like all the loss, the cultural loss, like that the parent loses connection to their village, like their neighborhood, to the neighbors, to their parents who would be the ones passing down wisdom, like ancestral medicine, or simple things like breastfeeding versus, in my mom's generation, they were teaching, like the nurses were telling her to like use formula. And so then later on in my life, I had a lot of allergies, and then it came out through eczema. A lot of the things that would be healing was just learning about the kind of information that would normally get passed down through a lineage in a consistent way. Since it was broken through migration, there was this kind of unmetabolized trauma, or there was just cultural loss, and a lot of it was like my mom was the first one to do it too, so she just was not connected to like resources, you know, and so, or support network. And so a lot of the a lot of that healing came like later on in my adulthood. Where it's sort of like, oh, she just needed, you know, to be connected to her village, you know. It wasn't like there's something wrong with me. In the US, you start to feel like as an Asian like woman, I always thought like, oh, there must be something wrong with me, or you have this sense of like cultural invalidation, I think, like societal, like you feel different, you feel like you don't belong, or there must be something personally wrong. But it was really just that there are cultural differences. And then also, like, I was disconnected from the culture. And then that led to a lot of confusion and feeling like I didn't belong. Part of what's happening in my awareness right now is like learning how my country has even affected my own heritage. Like how coming here, I learned like from my uncle through oral history that like my ancestors had to hide from US bombs, like in Chiayi, because the Japanese military bases were out here in Taiwan when they were colonizing it. And so it makes sense like how I had carried that much intergenerational trauma. Now it makes sense. It's like not only were your people colonized by Japan, they were then doubly harmed by the US bombing it during the war. Like that's a lot of trauma to carry. And then it was passed down. So then when you're like disconnected in the diaspora, you're just sort of feeling like the epigenetic effects of that. But then coming back and learning the history, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense.
This is a deep ocean water conversation, my friend, and I love it. I love it so much. These are things that I definitely want to talk about more on the show, and not just language. So I do thank you for sharing that part of your story. I do want to ask you about language in a practical sense of moving to Taiwan during this period. What was your experience like interacting and communicating with people using the Taiwanese Hokkien? How much were you able to communicate on your own? How much were you able to understand? Did you take any classes, or was it a soft landing, a rough landing? Like, how was it like using the language once you did get to Taiwan?
Yeah, when I first got here, my language skills were so non-existent that it was so rusty too, that people were like, are you Japanese? Are you from Hong Kong? Like you must, yeah. Even though I look Taiwanese, like, but now, so then we didn't understand each other. So in Taiwanese, we say "tia bo," like listening, no, like it means you don't understand, like "ting bu dong." So when I first got here, people would say "you man man lai," like take your time learning it. And then now it's going to be 2 years straight that I've been here, and now people say they're really nice. They say like, "Oh, 你讲的中文越来越好," like you're improving, like you're getting better. Like I can actually understand what you're saying, you know. But they're being polite. Like I've met like friends' kids, and they're like toddlers. And my Chinese, my Mandarin Chinese is like underneath their level, you know. And then like my Taiwanese is like, I would say it's like pre-verbal, like early stages. But I'm learning to like embrace that. Like I'm here, I'm learning. I just got this textbook actually. I brought it. And it comes with an audio CD. So I just borrowed my neighbor's boombox and I've been learning it that way. When I first got here, I was watching a lot of Taiwanese gangster movies, because it's kind of, I guess it's a stereotype too, because back in the day, actually, they would make fun of Taiwanese as like this low class language, or, you know what I mean? During martial law, there was, through Taiwan Twitter, I've learned when people shared their family histories, like that the language was made fun of, it was put down, it was seen as low class, or, and so I guess there's a stereotype that it's like spoken by gangsters or something, but it is a good way to learn is like to watch movies to hear how it's actually used. And I personally enjoy watching those movies, so I would pick up words that way. My dad actually told me that Taiwanese Hokkien was like Daiwan Wei is spoken in the churches here. And he was like, "Oh, you should go to church." And I've heard that echoed by other friends I've met here. They're like, "Yeah, that's a good way to learn." And so Christmas Day, I actually went to church. The service was all in uh like Daiwan Wei, like the characters. There's actually a written system of Taiwanese that a lot of folks actually don't know that because it's like that's the level of erasure there is that when I initially learned it, it was just phonetic without written characters. But now you can actually use Itaigi online to look up. You can add the Chinese characters and it comes up with Taiwanese characters, which are similar. And then the Taiwanese like Roma Pinyin. It's actually a good way to learn is to go to church because there are a lot of Taiwanese Christians and they use Daigi. And then before I came here, I was listening to a lot of bite-sized Taiwanese. It's like two really friendly guys. They have a lot of podcast episodes. And I feel like that's a really good introduction because they make it fun. So I would like when I go running in Berkeley, I would listen to bite-sized Taiwanese. And even like everywhere I go, like when I go to acupuncture, the nurses are speaking it. And then Takao Books also has children's books in Taiwanese. Not a ton, but they did have like maybe two or so. And then I went to Caves Books at this university called Wensao School of Languages. My Canadian friend actually had a copy of this book. And then I was coaching a student and she was a student at Wensao. And so I realized that there was a Caves book at Wensao. So I went there and then they didn't have it on the shelf, but I started chatting with the staff and they were really nice. And yeah, like I learned that like they learn Taiwanese in school for like a few years, but they learn English for like most of their schooling. And then they were really nice. Like they were looking up videos on YouTube and like letting me know what I could watch online of like bands that are playing music in Daigi or other Google like resources in Daigi. And then they were browsing like online bookshops and then found this book and then we ordered it. Pretty much like about 86% of the population down here in Kaohsiung probably understands Taiwanese. So it's a good way to learn because in Taipei, they probably speak a little bit more Zhongwen, like Mandarin.
Mm.
Yeah. And so everywhere I go, I can pretty much practice.
I would love to know, if anyone's listening to this conversation and they kind of feel similarly to you or they see themselves reflected at any point in your story about reconnecting with your heritage languages, with your identity, what would you say?
I guess like I kind of try to do that through Kuishimbo. It's kind of like what Yuri Kochiyama says. Like she's like cross borders, learn from other people in other countries, exchange information, travel, learn about how other people live, learn how to look at the world through other lenses. Maybe fall in love, like outsider culture. Even if you guys hurt each other in little ways, you start to learn how to coexist together, like and it's like through those little things that you start to build empathy or you start to understand another person. It's like go outside your own culture to see that there are dumplings all around the world or different kinds and just like yours, but they do it in a different way. Or maybe learn more, educate yourself, like learn more beyond what they teach you in school. Like, educate yourself. A lot of that takes critical thinking. So you have to start to question things. And I think at this stage in my life, like I feel like that's the education I would pass on. Like that's kind of like the learning that I'm going through right now. It's like this more critical decolonial kind of undoing, unlearning, and then relearning and reconnecting. And I think that in that, there's like this sense of empowerment, like a strengthening of your connection to your ancestors, to your grandparents, to your cultural heritage, and your tongue, like your language that feels more, that's a part of you. Like there are aspects of yourself that you're reconnecting with. And that there's something about that that's actually strengthens, like it kind of gives you like a rootedness, like a sense of purpose and also an understanding of where you come from and then maybe where you're going. So I would encourage younger folks to do that type of work. It's, I guess, an inner work, but also outer work. It's both.
Tell us a bit about your projects and the things that you're working on, and maybe how that is a reflection of, the journey that you're taking through reconnecting with your heritage.
Like when I got here, before I got here, I was processing a lot of grief about my grandparents, Akon and Ama, passing on. And I thought for many years, I didn't want to go back to Taiwan. I didn't even think about it because it would be too painful because they wouldn't be here. And so I didn't even think about it. But after a while, I started to want to still have a connection to the land and to the culture that felt like them. And they grew up in Tainan and Chiayi. And when I got here, I was hit with this immense regret. Like, why hadn't I recorded Akon and Ama? Now that I'm learning Taiwanese, like I don't have any videos of them speaking Taiwanese. Like, why hadn't I, like, I would just want to hear their voices speaking Taiwanese, like so simple. Why hadn't I asked them about what it was like to grow up in Tainan and Chiayi now that I visited those places, like on my own? So that's the regret, is like all of that. And so I was thinking about all of that, and then also thinking, well, I am here. What can I do? I could record the people that were close to them, who knew their stories, who grew up in those places, and who I see fairly regularly. I could record them and maybe take their portrait. I was kind of imagining this creative process. And then at the same time, I was getting a lot of questions like former students or like an aunt or relatives would ask, so are you going to teach English? Can you teach Japanese? I guess my response to that inquiry is the World Languages Project. Why limit yourself to, colonial languages? Like, why not learn a language? From my point of view, it's like, why not learn a language where if you're going to use that language to maybe one day study abroad or live and work abroad, even marry abroad, like why not learn a language where you could relocate to a country where you have better chance of survival, of thriving? That's my straight answer. I wanted to open up the lens a little bit because it is such a small country here. It's like this small country that's shaped like a yam. And because some folks haven't traveled outside of it, there's sort of this little bubble where the only options seem to be like learning English and learning Japanese, other than, but what about learning Taiwanese? What about Hakka? What about indigenous languages? What about global languages of countries you haven't heard about? I had a friend who had left a voice message once on Instagram, and I didn't know that you could do that. So that gave me the idea for like people to record words and greetings that way. And then like I spent an afternoon with my buddy, and he was recording tracks in this like audio production environment. And so I was kind of immersed in that type of space. And soon after that, I met his wife, and they ended up mentoring me that evening, just spontaneously. And then I recorded her sharing greetings in Tibetan for the project. And then I launched the project soon after that. But I also like being here in my grandparents' house, I was like looking at like going through their stuff, like, you know, because they have all these photo albums and like language learning dictionaries. And so I was realizing that like it goes back to them. Like Akon even, you know, because of the way he was treated, like during martial law, like he'd actually refused to speak Zhongwen, Mandarin. And I didn't know this because he encouraged me to speak Chinese. Like he actually sponsored me to go to Shida and like learn Chinese. And I didn't know this. And you know, I was at Shida and I was really excited because I was going to visit them and I learned. And I was so excited to practice with Akon and Ama now that I could speak Chinese. And then I came down here and I realized like that he wouldn't speak it with me. I guess I reconnected with like learning the cultural history and then wanting to learn more about how others were learning Taiwanese and how it's like firsthand from the people that are here and record them and connect with them. And so I felt like I wanted to build awareness about this thing, but it's not just me. It's like I'm part of a whole generation of Taiwanese folks in the Taiwanese diaspora who are returning to their parents' homeland, learning their heritage language, reconnecting with their cultural heritage. So I wanted to record and document it in my own way.
Let us know where we can find you on social media so that we can be a part of this joy too.
So I'm on IG at Kuishimbo Media. And then on Facebook, it's Kuishimbo. And I do upload all of the recordings for the project on YouTube at World Languages Project. And it's fairly new. I just launched it like just a few months ago. Yeah, I also have like my personal social accounts, but that's what I would follow, I guess.
Yeah.
Kuishimbo.
I will add the links to those in the show notes for this episode so that people can click and find you right away. This conversation has been really good. Like, I would even say great. And I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I feel like we are similar in age, and I feel like the way that you tell a story is very specific to our like micro generation way of telling stories and talking about things. So for me, it's been enjoyable to talk to someone who referenced growing up in the 80s and 90s like I did.
Awesome. Radical.
I know, totally rad. Thank you, because you shared a lot of your story, and I really appreciate talking about your story and how it relates to language and heritage and culture and food, because all of these things are tied together. One of the things that I really like to do with this show is show people that language is not necessarily extricable from culture, from history, from language, from identity. And it's really important to take all of these things together. So I thank you again for sharing your story, with language, for sharing your history. And, I honor your family with this episode as well. And I dedicate this episode, our conversation, to your family, to your relatives, your ancestors, and thank them also for being a part of you and part of your story, and sharing that story with all of us.
Dosha El. So in Taiwanese, we say dosha to say thank you. So dosha El.
Dosha.
Yeah, it just means like do is many, and then xia is kind of like xie xie the xie. It's like in Taiwanese it's xia, so it's many things. And then I guess we also say gamsha, which is like gratitude. So gamsha El. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always a joy to talk to you. I guess it's like online, but it's, I guess we're connecting. We're not really talking, but I guess through like through STP, I feel like I have gotten to know you a little bit. You're very warm and I feel like you are really great at like holding space. And I feel like, yeah, I think part of it for this level of language learning with cultural history, it's like I appreciate that I feel like you're able to hold space for all of me and I feel comfortable sharing all of me. And I really appreciate that because this level of language learning can feel like it really requires a certain level of comfort, you know, to see all of that and to understand. And I feel like you're really excellent at doing that. And so I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank
Gamsh.
you. Upsha. Thank you. I like to end each episode with the same question, just to have a little bit of fun. Let's see what we can do with this one. Do you have any jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Taiwanese Hokkien to share and to teach us?
I guess, well, here in Taiwan, if you say Taiwanese Hokkien, like no one will understand me if I say that. So we'll say, so Papa will told me like to use Daiwan Wei,
Taiwan way.
Dai Yi. And so in Taiwan Wei, when we say like what's up, like as a greeting, um, like when you see someone, you say hello, you know. In Taiwan, you can say Japabwe, and it means like, have you eaten yet?
Oh, I love that.
Literally, literally asking if you've had lunch or something. They're checking. Because in case you haven't, we're gonna get some food.
Oh, snap. That is the way to greet somebody. Please teach me that.
Japabwe. Ja-
Japawe,
Japabwe.
Japawe.
Yeah. I've also heard it said Japabe, but Japabwe is how I learned it.
Japawe.
They actually say it. Like I went out hiking with a bunch of Taiwanese folks and I watched them eat an entire meal. Like they got a bunch of plates with a bunch of like large portions and they finished it. And I was like, okay, so we're going to head home. And on the way back to the car, the guys were like on their phones talking about and they kept asking like, Jabawe, is there any more space left in your belly? And I thought they were joking. I seriously thought they were joking. Like, so I kept asking my friend, like, what's going on? Like, do they want to go get dessert or something? And it wasn't like dessert or tea. It was like this savory pork, like a red fried. Yeah. And it's made in this little town. It's like a Hakka community. And so we went to the little stand in and there was like a line, so we waited in the car and the guy came back and it came with a sauce and it's super grubby. We ate it.
Mm.
So I feel like that's like a really good Taiwanese
Yeah.
greeting to know.
I feel like I would fit in with that group because I'm like, especially when I travel, I'm like lunch, I'm like breakfast, second breakfast, lunch, maybe second lunch, early dinner, real dinner, because it's like I realize that my time is finite when I'm in another place. So I'm like, I want to hit everything. And not that I'll have a huge big meal everywhere, but I want to pick from like 7 different places a day so that I have an array of things to try. But I like that. And I think asking someone if they've eaten to say hello is amazing. I love that.
They're actually asking. So you want to say like eaten, you could say Japa. Japa.
Japa.
Like I've eaten. And then Do you want to learn something that's kind of like funny, but it's like I learned it from a gangster movie?
Sure.
Okay, so this is like I was watching this gangster movie called Gatao, The Last Stray, and the main character is like he's like the lieutenant gangster, and he finds out that the girl he's interested in is her uncle is part of the gang, and he goes, "Kao Bei." In the subtitles, it said, "No way." And I met the guys on the hike and I told him about it. And then he was like, "Oh, I thought it was Kabe." And he was like, "No, it's Kaobe." And so he taught me how to say it correctly. Um, but you don't want to say it to like, it's impolite to say to like the headmaster's wife or something. You just, you want to just say it to your friends. Like when you want to kind of say like, "Dang," or "Darn it," or "What the heck," to put a little emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, and then, yeah, I think the country, I don't know if it's because there was like famine or something when they were migrating, because everyone seems to be perpetually hungry. And like even the monkeys and even the turtles and the ducks and stuff. It's weird. So, so here in Taiwan, for like a grubber, like someone who loves to eat, they say "yao jia gui."
Yao Jia Kui.
Yeah, "yao jia gui." I think it literally means "love to eat monster." In Japanese,
It's
kushi,
me.
yeah, I think it's like food eater, glutton.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then since I'm a photographer, like I saw like a table once that was shaped like the shape of Taiwan, and I thought, "Oh my God, I have to take a picture." And so the guys, there were guys actually eating their like mung bean douhua, like right there, and they're eating on the table, and I was like, I guess they could be in the shot, but I asked my dad, like, how do I ask them if I could take a picture? And he said, "Gua gam e sai hip shong." So gua is I or me. I'm not sure gam e, but e sai is 可以, like, is it okay? And hip shong is take a picture. And then they replied, they said, "No problem. Bobunde." That's an easy one. Bobunde.
Open day.
Yeah, you could use that in Queens, I'm sure. If they speak Daegi, they might just speak Zhongwen. I don't know.
So many useful phrases. I love this. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing them, Erica. This has been a true pleasure again to talk with you, and I know that it's probably getting late for you on your end. So I really appreciate the, staying up, hanging out late with me to talk about your language and your culture. In this instance, in an instance like this, after you've been talking to someone for quite some time, in Taiwan, and you're about to go your separate ways, as we are in Taiwan, what would be the best way to say goodbye?
I like to say 再会, like bye. They actually just say bye bye.
Zai Hui, Erica, thank you again for this conversation, and I will be talking to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Elle, Dosha.
Bye.
Bye.
New episodes of Speaking Tongues are available every Monday, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to like and share episodes with other language lovers like ourselves. A bientôt!